Back in August of 2022, I made a video where I recommended 10 of what I considered underrated visual novels across different genres. If you haven't seen that video yet, I still heavily recommend those titles for the reasons I said in that video. However, since then, I read many different visual novels, including ones that are continuously going under the radar, both new and old. So in this video, I want to recommend 10 more what I consider underrated visual novels. The first visual novel I want to talk about is the Destiny Star Girlfriend series. This is a comedy-heavy moege visual novel that revolves around magical girls. A surprising rarity in the medium since most magical girl stories end up in the dark Nukigi genre, for example, Dead End Aegis. Destiny Star Girlfriend is one of the funnier, newer visual novels I've read in a really long time, and figuring out that the developer Mirai is a sister company to Minato-Soft, aka the creator of the Majiko series, just made too much sense. The premise of the main character and the magical girl in question being unable to be more than several meters apart without feeling pain is a pretty amusing way to kind of force them to eventually romantically get together. However, not only do I think the comedy is pretty goofy and over the top, I think that the romantic development is surprisingly quite solid. Sure, it does require a bit of the typical accidental pervert scenes, but the dialogue and the characters slowly learn each other's faults without fundamentally changing who they are just helps the story feel more balanced in an otherwise comedy-heavy visual novel with some occasional magical girl action scenes. Next, we have Kunado Chronicles, one of the newer visual novels developed by Purplesoft. Purplesoft is the developer of visual novels like Chrono Clock, Amatsutsumi, both having fairly decently big fan bases. However, for some reason, Kunado Chronicles was generally received a little bit more middling compared to those previously mentioned. While I do not think it's quite as good as Amatsutsumi, Aoitori, and some parts of Chrono Clock, I think Kunado has more than enough to make it at least a potentially interesting read to some people. I think the main reason for that is its unique world where it's a post-apocalyptic setting, but the main setting looks more like an old-school Japanese town. But the customs are quite a bit different, where gender roles are specifically reversed, where females are not only expected to lead, but are expected to be things like the aggressor or on top of the relationship. Completely the opposite of most cultures in real life. There's also some pretty amusing magic fights using Kododama, a huge upgrade in scale compared to how Kododama was used in Amatsutsumi. The route structure is exactly the same as Amatsutsumi, a ladder route structure, where I think one of the side heroines, Yuri, gets, in my opinion, one of the best non-true routes in any Purplesoft visual novel. The rest of the game is a little bit more hit or miss admittedly, but I think almost every character is likable, and the world is interesting enough for me to consider this an overall recommendation. A relatively normal guy attending a rich people's school, while uncommon, has been done in fairly big titles like Princess Evangel, Mashiro Ito Symphony, and King Koi Golden Love Reach. However, I think My Fair Princess, developed by Peas Soft, is a title that takes place in a rich school setting like those and is able to stand on its own merits. One of the things that I like right from the get-go is that the protagonist actually earns his way into this rich school through a scholarship, a surprisingly normal but wholesome way to support his family as opposed to the other titles mentioned, which are just more by accident or coincidence. The fact alone helps the relatively decently wholesome vibes of the visual novel. All has some melodrama here and there. It's generally a comfy ride with most of the heroines having their own personal issues related to their careers and how they have to handle themselves as rich girls. I only had issues with one route, but that one is easy to forgive when the rest of the visual novel is fairly decently consistent. If you want something that has a mostly unique execution of a wholesome rich girl moege slice of life, I think My Fair Princess is a good one to try out. The sci-fi mystery thriller visual novel genre is one that's generally quite popular, with titles like the Infinity series, Zero Escape series, and Raging Loop generally having high praise all across the board. However, for some reason, despite sharing similar concepts and writers to those, Root Double tends to be not in the same level of praise as the others, which is unfortunate because I think it's one of my personal favorites in that genre. Root Double has a really interesting concept of specifically having 9 main characters all trapped in an underground facility. The setting itself admittedly isn't that special considering these trapped in an area settings happen quite often in mystery stories, but I think for the most part, Root Double executes things generally pretty well. It has 2 main protagonists, one of which is actually adult age and actually has a really interesting reason for being an amnesiac. The characters have to work together to both survive and potentially find a way out of their bad situation. I also quite like the route system, even though you probably should read it in letter order as shown. The fact that you basically just switch around the timeline and see different characters' point of view in different areas is really interesting. There can be issues with pacing later on in the story, but I just come to expect that from mystery stories and visual novels. Overall, if you really like sci-fi mystery stories, I actually think Route Double is one of the better ones for a beginner, as long as you don't mind this really weird, goofy choice system using the Enneagram. Whenever I hear people talk about their favorite Animal Girl visual novels, it's usually Nekopara or occasionally something like Amarillo Chocolate or one of the routes in Fantasy Tavern Sextet. However, my personal favorite Animal Girl visual novel is easily Wanko to Kurasou, a visual novel that got a fan translation a long time ago. Unlike most Animal Girl visual novels that I've tried, which tend to be more on the shallow slice of life side with a lot of sex scenes, I actually find that Wanko to Kurasou has a wider genre variety than just those aspects. It actually has a surprising amount of world building with its dog girls, with their type of personality dictating what kind of career they're best suited for, whether it be a store owner, a guard dog, or social worker. There's a surprising amount of emotional Nakige moments, including a story about at least one or two dog girls being properly adopted, with one being a surprisingly great rescue dog girl story. That said, this visual novel does still have a decent amount of slice of life and sex scenes, but to me, it's more the mix of genres that helps Wanko to Kurasou feel more like a believable and balanced Animal Girl visual novel story. As long as you don't mind the lolly-looking designs and the fact that there's technically only two routes, both for human characters with their own Animal Girl pets, and I think Wanko to Kurasou is a very fun, very underrated Animal Girl visual novel. The next title is Kamiyaba, Destiny on a Dicey Deadline, developed by Hulot. The official English release by Shirobune did get some controversy because of their choice of localizing the term Oni-chan as Bubby, and the final release having a whole bunch of typos and such. However, if you can get over that, especially with a few patches fixing these issues, I think Kamiyaba is a surprisingly consistent, comfy time. It does have a goofy premise where the main protagonist has to be in a hurry to date a girl or else he'll be alone for the rest of his life. The destiny power levels going down or up depending on the romantic progression is a pretty unique and fun gimmick to watch unfold. But outside of that, I just think almost all the main heroines have some pretty interesting depth to them, and the character interactions are surprisingly wholesome and down to earth, not relying too much on what I call moe pandering, something I think Ubisoft overly relies on. Perhaps Kamiyaba goes a bit far on some troll tease humor at times, but at the end of the day, this is not a super deep game, generally defaulting back to goofy, lighthearted slice of life moments. If you want a decent mix of character depth while still maintaining a lighthearted atmosphere, I think Kamiyaba is a nice underrated moige to pick up. To go into the completely opposite direction of comfy, the next underrated visual novel I have is Bokuten, Why I Became an Angel, developed by Overdrive. I think utsuges in general as a genre are underrated since they can get a bit too depressing at times, much more than Nakies. However, in my opinion, Bokuten doesn't fall into the trap of getting overly unnecessarily depressing. While the story is pretty bittersweet right from the get-go, most of the drama does not feel stupidly forced. One of the main reasons I think Bokuten is massively underrated is because it has one of, if not my all-time favorite common route in any visual novel. It's a chapter-based title where the main character, Tomoe, has to help many different couples potentially get together. However, things are not black and white because every couple goes through legitimate, down-to-earth human issues relating to things like the couple's jobs, sexual orientation, or even just things like self-confidence. Every single choice in Bokuten usually makes a huge difference in how the relationships play out. Basically, even if Tomoe decides to intervene in a relationship, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the guaranteed best outcome for the couple in the long run. Although the main heroine routes are a little bit more hit or miss in terms of quality, each of them provide a really unique, interesting theme, with the true route having one of the best emotional true route endings I've seen in a visual novel. Bokuten did have some flaws to fix, but I think as far as pure romance utsuges go, Bokuten is absolutely one of the best, and in my opinion, still pretty underrated to this day. Going back into lighthearted territory is Renai Royale, developed by Asa Project. Asa Project as a moe company as a whole, I think is relatively underrated, with each and every one of their translated titles being heavily comedy focused, possibly the most comedy focused moe company I can think of. There's a subgenre many visual novel fans may not even be aware of called bakage, where the characters just act really idiotic and stupid. That fits Asa Project visual novels to a T. Sankaku Renai and Koikari Love for Hire, the first two Asa Project titles translated, I would say are pretty decently popular. The former for having nerdy love interests, and the latter having a goofy rent-a-boyfriend premise. However, for whatever reason, Renai Royale is generally not talked about as much. It may have the least unique premise of the three translated titles, being just a high school harem where every love interest is openly thirsty from the beginning, but I personally think Renai Royale is the most consistently hilarious visual novel of the three. I think every single character contributes pretty well with their own unique character jokes. Sure, the romance may not be the strongest, but if you're someone who just wants to read pure, stupid comedy slice of life, you definitely cannot go wrong with Renai Royale. With the insanely thirsty visual novel heroines going out of their way to heavily compete with each other to prove they are the true best girlfriend candidate for the main character in the funniest and most savage ways. Next up, we have another slice of life heavy title, the Sky Full of Stars or Miyazora Trilogy. The original visual novel on Steam does seem to be decently popular. However, my main concern for this video is specifically focusing more on its two fan discs, Fine Days and Interstellar Focus, both as of this video being limited to just fan translations. I did quite like the original Sky Full of Stars. It provides a very wholesome, down-to-earth romance story focused on astronomy, with similar writing to If My Heart Had Wings, a much more popular mainstream visual novel where I think the Sky Full of Stars kind of just lives under If My Heart Had Wings' shadow at this point. But going back to the fan discs, in Fine Days specifically, I think the afterstories for the original four heroines continue the wholesome vibes while still providing a surprising amount of decent character development and backstory that wasn't in the original. The new 3 routes are quite enjoyable in their own way, with Miharu being one of, if not the best executed teacher route in a visual novel I've read to this day. Interstellar Focus fan disc is one of the few polyamory routes that I legitimately really liked because the build up to it just made too much sense for the main 3 childhood friends, and I just also really like that it doubled as a way to give little bits of closure to every single minor character in a way. The final visual novel series I'm going to be talking about is what I consider the most criminally underrated on this list, the Criminal Border series. Yes, that pun was intended. This is an episodic visual novel series, and while it was developed by Purplesoft, if you look further, you'll notice that it has the exact same scenario writer as the 9-9 series. Personally, I think episode 1 alone of Criminal Border is a lot better than 9's first episode, which people generally seem to have lukewarm feelings on. Criminal Border is one of those visual novels that starts with a bang and almost never lets up. I like to call it a really intense psychological thriller where it has a really interesting premise where the main character makes an accidental goofy AMV that causes intense, instant horniness, where the users say it's some of the best sexual gratification they've had ever using it. This causes the digital drug to become a huge potential interest in the black market. Because of this, the main character Itsuki is constantly dragged around with many people begging to find a way to get around the established rules so they can use this digital drug for their own personal selfish use. Itsuki seems like he would be a pretty lame wussy protagonist, but it's actually really interesting to see him grow from all the dangerous situations he gets constantly put into, especially when he starts to make friends in the most unlikely places. And it gets surprisingly wholesome seeing the relationships between him and these newfound friends who I consider good people that have to do fucked up things. As of this video, while all 4 episodes are released in Japan, only 2 are translated in English. I'm usually the type to wait for the whole visual novel series to be translated before reading, but Criminal Border First and Second Offense were huge surprises to me, as each visual novel episode felt like a season of an airing anime where a lot happens in a relatively short time period at around 8 hours per visual novel. This is just one of the most consistently well-paced story visual novels I've ever read. It's a shame that many people aren't talking about it. I'm not sure if it's because of the odd art style, the premise, or both, because I think more modern visual novels could learn from the pacing of Criminal Border series. And that wraps up the video. These are visual novels I consider underrated, whether it's due to having a lower than 8.0 average on VNDB, low amount of people reading it, or just not being as well liked or received compared to how much I think it deserves to be. But anyways, what are your thoughts on the visual novels that I chose, and what are some visual novels that you consider underrated? Feel free to leave a comment below.